Well, why don't we? This will be a little bit on the fly because our absent speaker, who is on her way, is going to kick things off with a presentation. But we can at least lay a little bit of groundwork. Welcome back for those of you who have been coming regularly. I hope you had an enjoyable spring break. I hope you didn't do anything that you or somebody else regrets. A man can dream. And for those of you who don't know, I'm David Luberoff, coordinator of this semester's Open Classroom. I think I said in the last session before the break that those sort of 3 or 4 sessions before the break, and here we go. The 3 or 4 sessions before the break, in many respects, were devoted to what I think of as very traditional issues that show up in planning processes: housing, transportation, over the recent years, environmental issues, the economy. And after the break, these next several sessions, in many respects, are going to focus on what I think of as some of the emerging subjects and approaches that have started to come up and that make the Imagine Boston 2030 process and some other contemporary planning processes particularly interesting for those of us who are somewhat students of planning. And so to highlight that, so tonight we're going to revisit the idea of resiliency, but as it's been framed in Boston in a very different way. And then next week, just to let you know where we're going, in conjunction with Architecture Boston Magazine and the Boston Society of Architects, we're actually going to do a session on participatory, sort of new approaches to participatory planning that will in fact be a sort of pilot hands-on exercise in participatory planning. Russell Preston, who's a very interesting planner from Cambridge, who's been doing a lot of work on this, who has one of the major articles in the new issue of Architecture Boston, which will be available to you, which is focused entirely on the Imagine Boston planning process. We'll talk a little bit about his work in terms of how you engage communities and people who aren't often engaged in the process, and then actually have us break out into some smaller groups and go through some exercises. So I think that'll be a nice change of pace. And then the subsequent 2 sessions on March 30th and April 6th, and actually April 13th, so the next 3 sessions, will each look at areas that sometimes show up in the planning process, but I think in many respects Boston has brought them much more to the fore than you often see. So on March 30th, we'll be talking about the city's cultural planning efforts, an issue, at least in Boston, that arguably has not gotten the attention over the years from the public sector that it has in other communities. And then on April 6th, we'll be talking about education. We'll be joined by School Superintendent Tommy Chang and Ron Dorsey, the mayor's chief of education, and then John Ports, who teaches political science here. And again, some of us were at the Boston Foundation this morning hearing Superintendent Chang talk about his first 100 days agenda and the way they're talking about the schools and some of the efforts, including what I believe we'll focus on, which is an effort to think about what does a 21st century high school look like and how would we go about planning for that and shifting the school system to really produce a school like that and then make sure it happens in the way that we want it to. And that is linked with the Imagine Boston 2030 planning process in ways that hopefully we'll better understand. And then on the 13th, in conjunction with a class taught by Professor Dan O'Brien here at the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, we'll look at some of the really interesting ways that data and big data are shaping governance, in both in terms of what goes on the mayor's desk, what goes out to the public, how people are using that. Dan's a dear friend and is doing just some amazing work helping the city and the state and some other localities think about what you can do with some of the data you have. We'll have with us the city's Chief Information Officer, Lauren Lockwood, and Nigel Jacob, who many of you know, co-founder of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. But today, we are on resilience. Resilience, when we think about it in Boston, or we think about it as a policy issue, it seems to me presents a little bit of a conundrum. It has become this sort of word du jour or word de decade in urban policy. So particularly after Hurricane Sandy, the question of how resilient are communities in the face of climate change, and how might they better plan for that, looking at the disaster that was New York and the near disaster that was Boston. And we talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago with Matthias Ruth and Carl Spector and Chris Markey. And then, of course, after the marathon bombings, which is the source of that image, this idea of Boston as this tough, resilient city kind of emerged as one of the new tropes, as it were, about Boston, in addition to being home of lots of white Irish working class people, some of whom were gangsters and some of whom weren't, and one of whom was an idiot savant who cleaned floors at MIT, in Good Will Hunting, of course. That became, I think, a self-image of Boston. I got really interested in this question, and I said, well, when did we start talking about resiliency in Boston? And I went back, actually, in preparation for the launch event for the work that Atiya is going to describe in a minute, and ran a search and said, when and on what forms does the word resilience or resiliency appear in the headlines of the Boston Globe? And we can search that pretty easily back to 1872. Anybody have a guess as to what shows up if you type that in terms of the first appearances? I'm sorry? The Great Molasses Flood. I don't know about, was that resilient? It was sticky, but no. One would think the fire of 1872, the Great Fire that demolished. Nope. So Reconstruction, and there was a Coconut Grove fire here. The first reference to resilience that I could, was there another hand here? No. The first reference I could find to resilience in the Boston Globe was in 1910, and it was about tires. The new Michelin tires for cars were very resilient. The next reference doesn't show up for another 15 years, and it was things you could do to keep your hands beautiful and resilient in a health and beauty tips. Over the next 30-something years, till about 1960, the word resilient shows up about 40 times in the Boston Globe. It turns out to be something really popular to describe tires, so that one repeats. It often got used to describe either actors, sports stars, and particularly during both wars, soldiers. It occasionally showed up in this health and beauty thing. And then in the 1950s, there's a spate of articles about flooring. So the emergence of all these new resins that you could use, for that basement playroom floor. You didn't have to mess with that wood stuff. You could, put something down that was resilient. The first reference to Boston itself as a resilient city is actually 1959, when the Globe, writing about the opening of the Globe's then new building in Dorchester, quotes someone from the Boston Real Estate Board saying, "Boston's been through some tough times, but it's a resilient city." But that language never really gets used to describe Boston in the 60s. The only other urban issue time it appears is actually in the early 80s in describing Lynn after the Great Fire that destroyed 13 or 14 of the old shoe factories in Lynn. It says Lynn is a resilient city. So this idea of resilience and then Boston's reframing of it around using the resilience frame to think about social issues is very new. And on the other hand, I think as we explore this tonight, a lot of the issues that we're talking about are issues we've been wrestling with, or in some cases not wrestling with for a very long time, as I'm sure Bill Walzak will remind us. But what Boston did when the Rockefeller Foundation announced that it was going to fund resiliency planning work in 100 cities around the world, the 100 Resilient Cities Challenge. In Boston's application, it basically said, yes, we understand climate change, we understand we have to think about sea level rise, all the stuff we talked about a couple weeks ago. And it said, but just as large a threat are a variety of social issues and a variety of unfinished business from our history, and we really need to focus on that. A huge task, and it has fallen upon our first speaker, Atiya Martin, to direct that for the city. We were commenting, Atiya, before you came, that you have perhaps one of the most interesting biographies that one will ever run across. Atiya is now the city's Chief Resilience Officer, also is adjunct faculty here at Northeastern in the Homeland Security Program, and was previously the Director of Public Health Preparedness, which, if I understand it correctly, is the part of the Public Health Department that thinks about how do we prepare for disasters in terms of coordinating medical care. I was struck that it also involved coordinating mental health facilities. But before that, actually comes out of the Homeland Security, worked at the NSA, worked at the Boston Police Department. I gather was an analyst in focusing on the former Yugoslavia. And so Atiya is bringing, I think, this really interesting perspective of somebody who I gather started thinking about this from a security perspective, but has increasingly thought about it from a public health perspective. So we asked Atiya to take about 15 or 20 minutes. We'll probably have to take a pause here to load up your PowerPoint, to sort of tell us about this really interesting process that Boston has launched under her stewardship. And then we will move to a panel discussion that I'm very excited about with Atiya. Bill Walzak, who many of you know and who, if you've been a long-time attendee here, have heard before. Bill is one of really the founder of the Codman Square Health Center, Community Health Center, and the Codman Academy. A longtime civic activist, was the thinking person's candidate for mayor in 2013. And as Bill reminded me, when Adlai Stevenson was told he was the thinking man's candidate for president, he said that, of course, is the problem. There aren't enough thinking people. And Bill's been a great friend over the years and is now running the South End Community Health Center, sort of brought out of, I guess, retirement. Semi-retirement. But I thought it was interesting to have Bill here, somebody who's been really working in these fields for quite some time. And then Cassandra Campbell, another person I've gotten to know a little bit over the last year or so, one of the co-founders of something called Fresh Food Generation, which I will let her describe, but is a really interesting effort to address one of the underlying issues that I think Atiya is going to talk about, which is the lack of access to healthy food, and saying that if we really want to solve this problem, it's going to have to be solved in part by a private sector entity. And so Cassandra brings to us this, I think, very interesting perspective of somebody concerned about social justice, concerned about some very particular issues, but also saying, look, in the long run, to be sustainable, we have to figure out a way that people can actually make a living at this. And so she'll talk, which also makes her a small business person in the city of Boston, which, as many of you know, presents some interesting challenges. So with those framing remarks, let me turn things over to Atiya. Brian, if you want to give us a hand here for a second. And as I said again, welcome back.
No glitches that time, except that one. I'm really short, so I need a lot of bending. Okay, how's that? Good evening, everyone. So it is a pleasure to be with y'all this evening. I think most of you are still trying to figure out what a Chief Resilience Officer actually is. And so I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the process that we're going through within the city of Boston, where we're at, where we're going. But before I get there, I'm going to talk about some key framing foundational pieces, which are going to be, number one, when we talk about resilience, what are we talking about? And number two, how does that relate to equity? So it's going to be really fun and exciting, and you're going to be so excited, right? Yes, okay. So really what I wanted to do was kind of make sure that I gave you the full roadmap. This is the roadmap. Congratulations, you saw it, because I already said it. But I want to stick to this resilience piece. So according to 100 Resilient Cities, which funded my position in the 100 Resilient Cities across the world that are soon to be on 100, we're at 67 right now. We're going to be at 100. This is the definition that they use. And as you can see, they talk about two different things that people, institutions, organizations, and systems need to be resilient to, which are the chronic stresses, the things that tear at the fabric of our communities on a day-to-day basis, on a regular basis, as well as the acute shocks, the disasters, the natural hazards, natural disasters, the terrorism attacks, those big types of things that require large coordinated responses. But it's really the fact that there's no separation between the two. And that in fact, what we know based on our experience, as well as research, is that we can predetermine a lot of the poor outcomes of disasters based on the circumstances of communities today, right? So what does our infrastructure look like today? What are the circumstances of our communities today? What are the inequities in communities today? Because we know that the people who suffer the most in day-to-day life are the people who suffer disproportionately more after disasters. So none of this is rocket science. Some people will make it look like rocket science, and they'll show you a bunch of numbers and stuff and lines and all that stuff. Fundamentally, this is not rocket science. And these are things that we know intrinsically as people who live in our neighborhoods and in our communities and have had those smaller level emergencies happen, like flooding on our streets, like a power outage. And these are types of things that we know in certain communities that can be a difference between life and death if you are on medical equipment that requires electricity. It can be the difference between having to sit in the dark and figure things out versus being able to go to a neighbor's house or a friend's house or a family member's house, depending on what your social networks are. And we know that social isolation is a huge part of inequities that we see outcome. So this is kind of the framing that 100 Resilient Cities uses, and it's that connection, and this is what distinguishes resilience from the traditional emergency management, homeland security stuff, is that it brings those two worlds together in a way that we have never done before, and looks at how they are, how one affects the other. Oh, there it is, we tried. Okay, and so this is one of my favorite quotes about resilience, in the sense that it is about us working through those hard challenges, because we don't really know truly about our level of resilience until something happens. In the meantime, us prioritizing our most significant challenges, us working towards how we're going to address those challenges, are really at the core of building the types of resilience that we need in order to work through whatever comes our way. So this idea of how did we land on equity? So let's talk about what equity is. So most people think of equality and equity in the same breath, but they're two very different things, right? I'm not going to read this to you. Good? Okay, what about this one? Right? Okay, one more. This one. This is the opposite of the baseball one. So what we know is that everyone having resources equally today is not going to get us the types of leaps and bounds in progress that we need to make as a city, because what we understand is that the historical context of how we got to today was built on inequities. Right, was built on people getting more than others based on nothing more than race, based on nothing more than class, based on nothing more than kind of, you can keep going down the line. So when we think about these challenges that we face, that it's not a difference between, it's not equality in the way that we normally think about it, in that everyone gets the same thing. Every neighborhood needs different things. We all as individuals need different things. And so as we think about policies and practices, how do we make sure that we're not perpetuating inequities by giving everyone something equally? How do we make sure that we're customizing what we're doing in a way that actually meets the needs of our residents, which vary depending on what neighborhood we're talking about? So part of this, okay, I'm just going to use the controls, is not to cause anyone any problems, because that is annoying. So when we think about resilience in that same context of the fact that there are different domains of resilience, We know that in the past, traditionally, when people talk about resilience, they talk about economy, they talk about the critical infrastructure we depend on, the built environment, natural environment. We don't often talk about people, which is why it's unfortunate that it's a new thing. This social resilience is something new that's happening in planning, when in fact, many folks have been advocating for this for many years by just asking the question, what about people? What about what people need in communities? And so really being proactive and meaningful in the way that we approach incorporating the people question into the sphere of resilience. And so really, if we flip it, most people say that those things are equally weighted. And, so we propose in Boston that they're not equally weighted. And in fact, that all of the non-people related things are very much interrelated with the people part. They're related to each other as well. No doubt about that. But really, all of those things serve people, and the circumstances of people is what determines those other pieces. And the decisions that people make determine those other pieces. So when we think about resilience as all of these different domains, that the social piece of it is really not something separate from these, but very much should be ingrained in all of them. Because when we think about natural environment and which ones we prioritize preserving, we need to think about, well, which ones have the most impact on people. When we think about the built environment, we need to ask that question about people, all of these, the same questions. So that being said, let's take a look at the city of Boston in some hotspot maps, right? So red means there's lots of people in that area, highly statistically concentrated, who are dealing with this particular issue. In this case, it's social isolation. Social isolation is not in the census data. You will not find it. However, what we know from the research around social isolation is that the groups who are considered most socially isolated are older adults who live alone, and single-parent households with children that don't have any other adults in the household. And so this is an amalgamation of the two in the sense that they are, for the most part, mutually exclusive. So it gives you a very extreme representation of where we're seeing those concentrations in Boston of the most socially isolated folks. And social isolation is so important because when we think about the things that make strong communities, resilient communities, the research has shown us that actually it's these social networks, it's people's connections to each other, it's people's ability to navigate the systems that are there to serve them, both within their communities as well as government. And so it's those pieces that really determine how well an area does after a disaster. And so that's why this social isolation piece is so significant in terms of where we're seeing those high concentrations. So when we think about low to no income, right, and again, these are census tracts. What I always forget to say, what I'm going to say this time, is that the blue is the opposite. It means that there are the least number of people in those areas. And so when we think about low to no income, we see a similar pattern. We include that Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, pieces of Allston, Brighton. We have lots of students there. We also have a large Brazilian immigrant population as well as Russian. And then in East Boston as well, we have a large immigrant population, mostly from South America. And then we see some other areas in here where there are housing developments. People with disabilities, this is usually surprising to people. They are highly concentrated in these same neighborhoods, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, parts of South End, mainly because there's a housing development there. And East Boston, there's a housing development in that space as well. Limited English proficiency in terms of what are the languages spoken at home and what level, whether people can speak it just a little, not at all, or some. So limited English proficiency, we see the same distributions. People of color, and this is the whole range of people of color where they're statistically highest concentrated. So that gets us all the way down into Hyde Park, that contiguous area all the way up, including East Boston. What's missing here is Chinatown because of the way the census tract is laid out. And so it gets lost in the statistics of a analysis like this, but no doubt about it, Chinatown has been one of our close partners. And when we think about concentrations of communities of color, that would also be one of them that this type of analysis tends to exclude. Now, this is the one that gets me every time. So we just talked about all those different challenges in communities, and this is where the highest concentration of our children are in the city of Boston. So when we think about the fact, number one, that we're a city that has more than 50% communities of people of color, and so that's about, right now the numbers are about 54%. And then we also think about the fact that the population of children are growing, and then we think about these inequity challenges. That means we have a lot of work to do on thinking about and taking action on integrating all of our residents into the opportunities that we have in the city. And not just that, but also in how do we make sure that we are a successful city, because that's what is going to make us successful, is to make sure that we're including all of our human potential, all of our human capital in how we move forward as a city. And so this work that I've done up to this point has been around teasing out these pieces and making sure that we're all on the same page about what these things mean and how we got here today. And so when the conversations we usually have about race and racism are rooted in individual behavior, we talk about racists as individuals, but really it's something that's less insidious. It's something that is the way that we've been socialized to believe about other people that some of us act on, right? So all of us have been taught to believe certain things about other people and about ourselves, and that's part of the human condition. It's part of the way that we've kind of been grown and raised within this city and across the United States and in other countries. And so when we think about how we got here today to the inequities that we see, they're based on a long history of policies and practices that have kind of been led to here by the lack of access by people of color to certain resources, whether we're talking about what happened with redlining and the way the housing stock was accessible or not accessible, depending on what neighborhoods we were talking about, whether we're talking about equal access to veterans benefits, whether it's the housing loan assistance or the education piece, that was not equally accessible and therefore led to inequities. And so when we think about what this means in terms of racism being a system that is usually not intentional, we have become within our collective psyche to believe certain things, right? And so there's certain coded language that happens that perpetuates certain thinking. So when we say urban, what do you think of? Inner city, right? So it's that type of thing that kind of perpetuates certain thinking without even calling out race. And so it keeps us moving in the wrong direction because we never can really have a conversation in a meaningful way. And so then when we talk about racial equity, we're really talking about closing those gaps in proactive, meaningful ways and making sure that as we build the types of systems we want to see, that we're actually staying on top of it with monitoring and making sure that we're keeping track of the direction that we're trying to go in, which is that everyone has access to opportunities and that they're supported in achieving them. And that we have when you do that, what experience has shown us that when you do that, you actually improve access for everybody, because there are a lot of things about the system that benefit some people and not others that actually aren't that great for anyone. And so there have been some amazing lessons learned that I don't have time to get into right now, but maybe someone will ask me questions later. So 100 Resilient Cities has been talked about already, so I won't spend time on that. I will say that we have a very short timeline. I won't go into the details. You're going to ask me about this as a question. But really, we're finishing up phase 1 right now, which gets us into releasing the preliminary resilience assessment. I just saw the final draft today. I'm very excited, and it really just talks about the process I've gone through up to this point. And then that transitions us into really looking at the opportunities we have to dig deeper into the priorities that people express as the direction we need to go as a city, what we need to focus on, and then convening working groups in order to really narrow the scope of the list of recommendations that we identify that we can do that give us multiple benefits, as well as help to address some of the challenges that we've identified in terms of racial equity. And then we get into implementation within July, August timeframe. So it's fast. Welcome to my world. I'm going to keep moving. And so this is the engagement that happened up to this point. Really over 164 meetings. I'm still meeting with people. I haven't stopped. This is kind of a snapshot in time, but really this was for the purposes of being able to put together the preliminary resilience assessment to capture the snapshot in time. But I think, as was discussed earlier, community engagement and really understanding where people are coming from, that we're really taking the time to do that and do it in an ongoing way, and that it's not a drop in, drop out kind of thing. People want to know what happened afterwards, what you come up with, and how they can continue to be involved in the decision-making process and implementation. So that's all those numbers. I won't read them to you. They're there. That's what happened. And so what we saw was that we saw some trends and some of the issue areas that came to the forefront. And I won't read this to you, but I'll just tell you that it was a lot about housing, affordable housing, people concerned about the ability to stay in their communities because they were worried about the cost of housing and being pushed out, especially in communities of color, where we're already starting to see some of the trends that happen in South End. People are worried about that and what that means for them and their families if they want to stay here in Boston, where they grew up, where their parents grew up. We also saw a lot of concern about education inequities and how that plays into the pipeline to being able to access economic opportunities. A lot of work around connecting the dots between all these different planning processes we have in the city of Boston. And the last thing I'll talk about is this promotes cohesive and engaged communities. This was really about how we engage communities as government and other institutions. They're not that happy with the way anyone's engaging the community in terms of the way that it happens, what the timing of things, the announcements of things, but also the type of engagement it is, and that there's a spectrum of engagement that we haven't quite nailed down collectively as a city, but there are some silos and pockets of excellence that we can tap into. What we also looked at was what are we doing right now, and what has been done is ongoing, and these are some of the trends. So we saw a lot more happening around the empowers a broad range of stakeholders, which is really with sub-coded under there is education, and then supports livelihoods and employment. Again, this was about access to jobs here. So we have some programs that secondarily do this as well. But really what we learned here was that we have a lot more work to do around the way that we engage communities, because we didn't have as many proactive initiatives that actually addressed the thing that folks wanted us to talk about often. So where we actually landed was that racial equity and social cohesion is our cross-cutting theme. That household economic resilience, which is really getting us to building assets in communities, especially to address the intergenerational wealth gap. Community and civic engagement. This gets into kind of what I started to talk about before, but really how we're engaging communities and how we're developing the types of meaningful relationships that are ongoing and not just when I need to bungee in and bungee out for my one-off plan or initiative. As well as how we support communities in being engaged within their own communities and advocating for their communities, and learning how to navigate City Hall and all that means. I will leave it at that. It just means a lot to have to figure out how to navigate it. But how do we help people better understand that so they can advocate better for their communities and go and hit the right nodes within the system? Critical infrastructure resilience, that gets to that relationship with the critical systems we depend on across all communities, but we also know that we haven't fully understood the interconnectivity between them or interdependencies and how it impacts real people in communities. And what does that really mean as we think about climate change and as we think about the increase in inequities in the city and our understanding of how you map all of that stuff out. So instead of us going the traditional route of just doing a analysis where we look at the stuff and the infrastructure and all those things I talked about before, that we insert in their people and understand how this is going to impact different communities. This resilience in all policies and practices gets us to a framework at the end of this that we really need to have something that we can share within government and with our collective Boston community, private sector community organizations that can really get us to a place where folks are looking at some of the same considerations for, as I'm going through this process, have I actually engaged certain parts of the community? Have I understood the thing that I'm doing, how it's going to impact communities? So really kind of developing something that can be used to make sure that we're not perpetuating inequities, but also addressing these very specific issues that came up through the engagement. And then this last piece, I put this here as last because it's very much related to the first piece around racial equity and social cohesion, because what we know is that there's lots of different types of trauma, but when you think about the difference between individual trauma as an individual, as I walk through this world, that I experience things, and all of us have experienced difficult things in our lives, people who have died, and in some communities, there's a higher rate of things that are happening that are traumatizing for people on an ongoing basis. In addition to that individual level trauma, there's this systemic piece that I kind of mentioned before around, we've had a history of policies and practices, and then there's this concept called betrayal trauma. And when you have someone that's of authority, of someone that you think is supposed to be there to help you, as well as organizations that are supposed to be there to help you, and you go to them and instead you get harmed, it creates a very strong, powerful type of trauma that we don't usually talk about or recognize. And so within lots of our communities of color, there's been this historic back and forth around not having your voice heard, around not being able to be a part of decision-making processes, around disinvestment. And so these are types of things perpetuate inequities, but they also perpetuate the psychological trauma that people experience, as well as the individual trauma. So it's this very unique thing that we don't usually talk about, but there's a lot of reports starting to come out around this in the relationship between collective and individual trauma. So we're looking at this from a perspective of the role of residents, institutions, and sectors or industries, as well as this culture shift that will help us lead to the type of resilience that we hope that we can achieve. That's a foundational type of resilience. So the last few things I'll show you is the Racial Equity Working Group that we've convened is representative of a lot of different organizations and activists, folks who have been engaged in trying to advance racial equity and social justice in Boston for many years. And it also includes a Resilience Steering Committee that's also a whole range of folks, everything from the private sector to advocates, nonprofits, the whole range. These are the words that they came up with in terms of what they hope for this resilient strategy process moving forward. Now, what I found so powerful about this is it is not usually associated with government, but it doesn't mean that it can't be. And so the unique thing that I'm excited about this experience and this process, even up to this point, has been the amount of collaboration that's happened across different organizations and agencies that has led to the type of hope and energy that's required to move this type of work forward in the long term. So the 100 Resilient Cities grant is a 2-year grant. However, the mayor's committed to funding it moving forward, but it's really an opportunity to lay the type of foundation that we need to really truly be resilient at our core, and not just in rhetoric. And that means that all residents within the city of Boston have the opportunity to have that same access to the connections and the type of opportunities that allow us to do well against the day-to-day challenges, as well as those acute shocks and disasters that they like to talk about, those terrorism incidents and natural disasters. So really, I'm wrapping up here, because I think how am I doing on time? Am I doing okay? He said, okay, good. So this is really what we're talking about, really getting to this one Boston that we talk about, but really making that a reality for all of us, and that we all have a role to play in that. And this is one of my favorite quotes that I share at every presentation, because it is representative of this work moving forward, is that it is an incredible opportunity. We have international connections and energy around this. We have a mayor who's supportive of really moving this work forward. We have lots of partners, but all opportunities come with a lot of work. So we have a lot of work to do as well. So I'm going to end there and just say thank you, and I look forward to the panel discussion.